this is, some good overview of Sikich. We've been a firm for over 35 years. We started off as an audit, accounting, and tax firm. They're really focused on those traditional services, and then pretty quickly added on to our technology team. So, we have a full suite of technology services, historically focused around ERP delivery, as well as IT services, the cybersecurity team that Kevin's going to talk a bit about, and then most recently our Salesforce team, which I'm a part of. So super excited to be under the Sikich umbrella, and it's a great firm. It's awesome to be able to leverage these different service areas as we go in and really focus on making our clients successful. From a Salesforce practice perspective, we are pretty heavily focused on financial services. We are a Salesforce Gold partner. We have a team of FSC accredited consultants that come from a mix of Salesforce delivery backgrounds as well as industry. From that, we've really built out what is we consider to be kind of our secret sauce on the delivery side of our accelerator, combined with our Quick Start program. So this is a set of tools, or a library of tools, that we're able to really help our clients based on best practices, based on industry standards, get up and running quickly on the FSC platform. We've done over 450 implementations in the FinServ space, and as well, and very importantly, we have a library of 30 components and tools that we use for common data migrations and integrations as it pertains to specific platforms for planning and the things that we see in the financial services space. To talk a little bit about Salesforce, and from a security perspective, some of the things that are included. Some of these may be familiar to you, some of these may be newer, but we wanted to just hit on a few high-level things for you to think about before kind of diving into some of the Sikich specific cyber security services and the overview. Health check is a great tool to start with. So this is really, if you haven't run health check or taken a look in your Salesforce org, or you're considering implementing Salesforce, this is something that you can quickly get a good snapshot of, where you're at. This is going to scan your existing Salesforce org and kind of give you a baseline of where you're at. One of the really great things about this tool is, depending on what your security protocols and what your different formulas are for how you're really determining what the acceptable level of openness or lockdown for your organization is you can use the Salesforce baseline formula, or you can create your own custom formula for what the data access rules and policies are within your organization. And so that score is really based on a value of high, medium, and low critical values in your organization. So a good tool for kind of taking that initial look, and then can really dive into and drill down into specifics and customize that for your org. And then it also even includes, if you are allowing client access through a portal or a community, then there's some health reports there to really give you an idea of what data you might be exposing out to that community to make sure you're comfortable with those settings. All right, moving from health check onto the data mask. This is really important and often overlooked when we do, especially as you're working with a partner like Sikich and we're doing work with you in a sandbox environment. So we're preparing for either a new deployment, or we're working on updating an existing org with some new functionality. It's still equally important to make sure we're protecting that data within that sandbox environment. So the data mask features, this is relatively new to Salesforce. It's a great addition to the platform, and is focused specifically on sandbox orgs. So we can anonymize data to unreadable results. We can convert data into a readable but unrelated value. And so this really protects that data, but then allows your partner or your third-party development team to work with data that represents, that looks and feels like your actual live data, but isn't exposing that beyond the sandbox environment. It can also be deleted, and once it is masked, you can't unmask the data, so there's no risk of someone getting in and taking a look or being able to turn that data back into the actual client facing data. So this is a great addition to the quiver of security tools on the Salesforce side. And beyond that, as you look into some more advanced tools, Salesforce Shield is often something that we'll work with clients on in the financial services in an implementation for really, a further level of protection. So this is, includes really 3 flavors here. We've got platform encryption. So this is a native encryption service for your Salesforce data. And it can encrypt your standard custom fields, also importantly, files and attachments, any important data that you're putting in your Salesforce production environment. And then we'll work with features like chatter and search and lookup, so you lose functionality due to that encryption service. And you can even, for those of you more involved in some of the deployment, if you need to bring in customer managed encryption keys, then it supports that. Okay. The next piece of Shield is really focused around the field audit history. So, again, this is really giving you a record of when data changes within your org. You can determine, what exactly and what the high value areas are that we want to take a look at. And this is an audit trail, what it's providing with up to 10 years of history. We can create and manage, different data retention policies. And then this is built on the Salesforce Big Data backend, so it will scale for, especially for, you may have years and years of client history, client records that need to be protected, or you may be required to keep. So this is a great way to make sure we've got a record of that history. And then the last piece of the Salesforce Shield platform is event monitoring. So this is really being able to determine who's accessing your data, where they're coming from. It can also help with application performance. And so making sure that we, not only from a access and security perspective, but also just from an overall user experience and adoption perspective, we can see what's happening within the application. So beyond just protecting, encrypting, and knowing the history of the data, knowing exactly what users are doing within the system. Another great component to this is all of this event monitoring is available to be pulled out of the Salesforce platform. And so if you're using a third-party visualization tool or Einstein, then you can pull that data in to then further analyze that and take a look. So that's a quick, really quick overview of some of the Salesforce components. I'm going to hand off now to Kevin to really kind of dive into, what we offer beyond just the Salesforce functionality here at Sikich.
All right. Thanks, Miles. Hi, everybody. Kevin Baugh. I work in our cybersecurity practice here at Sikich. My background, I worked for about 12 years doing security stuff for a regional bank. For the last 10 years or so, I've been doing the security consulting thing. Currently, I lead our teams responsible for penetration testing or ethical hacking, trying to break into networks to show where vulnerabilities are, and the team responsible for our forensic investigations. So we do a lot of credit card breaches. We're one of only a handful of companies in the country that are certified to investigate credit card breaches, and a variety of other types of security incidents. We'll go through a couple of those here in the presentation. In addition to those types of things, our team does IT audits, other compliance and risk assessments. We provide security awareness training. So pretty whole variety of cybersecurity services that Sikich can provide. So Mike, if you want to advance. So the first topic I want to talk about is basically what is the largest cybersecurity risk we're seeing facing most organizations today. And if we advance to the next slide, we'll see kind of how that starts for most people. The answer is it's ransomware or cyber extortion. And for most people, they first learn about this at their organization when they walk in Monday morning and they try to open their Excel spreadsheets or whatever critical applications. And instead of opening, they start getting messages like this. Your files are encrypted. To unlock your files, you must pay us. Maybe they give you a Bitcoin ID, maybe they give you an email address, but that's always kind of the first view they see. Mike, if you want to advance. But when people hear ransomware, they think of the ransomware of 5 and 10 years ago, which was just like viruses that spread on the internet on their own and maybe infect your PC and you can't get into your PC. But today's ransomware or cyber extortion attacks are much different than that. It's actually attackers actively targeting businesses. They like to target small businesses because they got a weak security posture. They like to target things like financial services, healthcare. You see a lot of government, like last year, you saw a lot of news articles about government entities that were attacked with ransomware. I think there's just as much of that going on, just there's so much other news right now, you're not seeing those articles. But in these attacks, the attackers are very hands-on. They're actually, again, picking out a company to target, doing active phishing or other active attacks to get a foothold, and then going from there. And I think if we advance to the next slide. So we've got a short video here to show one technique that attackers use. And it's the same technique we as, I guess, penetration testers use when we're doing penetration tests for our clients. What this is showing is we've collected a bunch of password breach dumps that attackers have thrown out to the internet. So when they break into companies like LinkedIn or Dropbox or whatever, they'll grab all that company's passwords and then to kind of show they'll dump them to the internet. Well, attackers can grab those password dumps. We can grab those password dumps, and this is what they look like. I took one of those password dumps and just searched it for any any email addresses that have the kind of andsons.com string in it, and you can see tons of companies with users with an email address as andsons.com, and then this corresponding password that that person had used at like LinkedIn or Facebook or something like that. So attackers will use this to say, okay, well, if that person used that password at LinkedIn, did they also use it for their Office 365 email? Did they also use it for Salesforce? So just a good example of one of the many ways that kind of passwords are out there on the internet because people reuse them, and that maybe gives an attacker a good foothold. Mike, if you want to advance to the next slide. So that's one of the ways they get some passwords, maybe through that kind of password guessing attack or stealing them off of kind of password reuse. And then from there, they use that password through remote access services. Those are things like VPN, virtual private network, remote desktop protocols that give you like keyboard, video, and mouse on a remote machine. Those are the most common ways in that attackers are using for these ransomware attacks. And I think we're seeing a jump in this because so many organizations in the COVID-19 pandemic are kind of racing to add remote access services or increase the capacity, and maybe aren't doing that in the most secure manner just because they're trying to do it fast. So they're not putting it in with strong passwords or multi-factor authentication, not putting all the right security controls around it. So potentially a growth there. But basically, once that attacker has one password and maybe it works on the VPN or remote desktop, that's all it takes for them to really find a foothold to take over your network. An important thing to note is they've gotten a password, and from there they're using built-in like Windows networking protocols or things like that. They're not using viruses. They're doing things that administrators would do if they were on your network. So it bypasses antivirus. Your tools in place like your antivirus don't raise alarms that something bad is happening. Once they're on the network that way, they start escalating their privileges to try and become an administrator on the network, steal passwords from memory on computers they can get into to do that. Another number of different techniques to just take over the whole network. So again, showing that this is so much different than the old ransomware that was just, it infected a machine. This is an attacker looking around your network, inspecting servers, looking for things like your backup servers to say, hey, when I encrypt all their data, let's see if I can destroy all the backups at the same time so they can't recover from backup. So after they do all that research, then they lie in wait. And typically they lie in wait for a weekend. We almost always see like Friday night, Saturday morning, they start, just all at once encrypting servers and workstations. Mike, if you want to advance. And as you can see from there, you walk in Monday morning and everything's encrypted and you've got a few choices. The first choice here is paying the ransom. What I'm kind of showing on this slide, there's a lot of different ransomware organizations. Ryuk is a common one. And there's actually websites out there that track these ransomware organizations. You know, the statistic here is how much does REAC typically ask for their kind of ransom payout? And the other statistic here is even if you pay that, what is the likelihood that you'll get your data back? You can see that there's, you know, maybe 20% of people who've paid the ransom still didn't get their data back. So really big, really damaging attack for a lot of organizations that, you know, whenever we work with clients who are going under this attack, it's just they're surprised how much they underestimated both the likelihood that this would hit them and the impact it'd have on their organization. If we go to the next slide. So, you know, if you don't want to pay the ransom, well, another option here, in either way, you've got to clean the affected systems. If you try and clean them in place, it often ends up being kind of a whack-a-mole type situation where you're trying to find all the systems the attacker got into. Maybe the attacker is still active, encrypting more systems, and you're trying to stop that. It's really a tough place to be in once the attacker's in doing this, to try and find where they knock them out and keep your business up and running at the same time. Which gets us to the third option, which is the next slide here, which is rebuild from scratch. And I call this the nuke from orbit option. We had an organization do this with a small manufacturer. They had their network hit and they're like, we're just going to turn everything off and reinstall it from scratch. And they were offline for almost 2 full weeks to rebuild it. But that was the only way that they could have the confidence that everything was safe, everything was secure, the attacker was out of the network. Again, big impact to their organization, and they vastly underestimated the likelihood and the impact it would have before it happened to them. We're going to advance to the next slide. So what can you as an organizer, what can your organization do about this? Well, the first one is to make sure you have good backups, that everything important is backed up. Most of the organizations that are hit with this, they find out, oh, I think we might have to pay the ransom because this server wasn't backed up, or people were storing stuff on their workstations that was critical. So making sure you've got backups. If you've got backups, then you're just at a I have to recover standpoint. You're not at a I have to recover and should I pay the ransom standpoint. The next big thing is to keep those backups offline or some other ways protected from the network. As I said, the attackers are looking for your backups, looking for an opportunity to destroy those at the same time that they're encrypting everything on your network. If your backups are being written to tapes that go on a shelf, the attacker can't get to them. If the backups are being written to a cloud backup service and not just to a disk on a server inside one of your other offices, you know, that cloud backup service typically can prevent the attacker from deleting those backups. So looking at the backup strategy, and are our backups protected from an attacker trying to destroy them who's gotten administrative passwords to the network. The third one here is using good, strong, unique passwords, using multi-factor authentication. So it's the first time I've talked about that. So multi-factor authentication, I'm sure you've used it on some of the services you work with today. In addition to entering your user ID and password, you're going to enter some other factor. Maybe it's a code you get through an SMS text. Maybe it's pushing a button on your phone to say, yes, I've got this phone in my possession type of thing. That's the multi-factor authentication. That really helps prevent these ransomware attacks because, as I said, they're typically coming in through remote access, your VPN, your RDP, things like that. Hardening Windows, so making sure that you're not just using default settings, but there's a number of Windows hardening settings that make it harder for an attacker to encrypt the system, to do that without being detected. I won't go through the details there, but you know, are your IT staff locking down your Windows servers and workstations enough? Isolating and controlling administrative accounts and passwords. So there again, we see a lot of organizations where Joe, the IT admin, has one account. He uses it for his email, he logs into it from home, but he also uses that account to be an administrator of the network. And so any place where he might log in using that password is a place where that administrative credential could get stolen. Our recommendation is that privileged people have one account for daily use like email and things like that, and a separate account with a separate password for when they want to do administrative tasks. Finally, configure logging. You know, we often find when we walk in to help a client with one of these breaches that they've configured their servers for kind of default logging. On Windows, default logging often means only 3 days worth of like security event logs. So if the attacker's been in your network even for 2 weeks, you only know what they might have done for the last 2 or 3 days. So getting a greater level of detail, a longer retention period, centralizing those logs can really help when that event occurs. And then finally, performing some type of testing against your network to see how resilient it is against these type of attacks. Penetration testing would be hiring somebody to come in and try and break in, simulate that they're one of these ransomware attackers and find the holes that would allow one of these attackers to get in. Next slide. So that's the ransomware attack. It's really an attack against your corporate network and your workstations and things like that. I guess the next big question then, and the other big attack we're seeing, is how are attackers targeting cloud services like Salesforce? And if we go to the next slide, you know, the foothold here is more often phishing attacks. This is a quick video we'll run. It's showing, again, kind of a sophisticated phishing attack or techniques that phishing attackers are using. Mike, if you're able to start that video. But what it shows here is, let's simulate assume that I've sent someone an email to say, hey, go look at this blog on the Sikich blog site. You know, so the attacker sent this email that said, look at this blog at the Sikich blog site. I start reading the blog, I get bored, you know, I go to another tab to read the news. You know, just kind of typical activity. I left that Sikich blog tab there. Maybe I'll come back and read it later. If you were watching that Sikich blog tab, you might have noticed that it changed. It now looks like Microsoft sign into your account. And if I go back to that screen, hey, it's my Office 365 login, or it could be my Salesforce login or something like that. It's not really obvious that that was an evil attacker's page. It even has HTTPS. It even has most of what looks like a Microsoft URL, though if you're crafty, you'll see there's a 5kch.net or elite speak for sikich.net at the end of it. So this is what we call tab nabbing. It's really a technique where attackers can, you know, potentially grab cloud credentials, including grabbing like a multi-factor authentication token. And then they'll have that one token to then send on to the real site and log in as you. So that's just one of many kind of sophisticated techniques that attackers are using to steal passwords for cloud services. And really what I'm trying to highlight here is, in the old world, your first line of defense against attacks was your firewall. It protected your network from the evil internet. Today, your first line of defense against evil attackers are your users' credentials, are your employees' credentials, because that's the first line of defense for most of the things they're accessing, for the VPN, for their cloud services. It's really a shift and change from that firewall being that protection to your users and their passwords being that first line of protection to your customer data or your sensitive financial data, things like that. If we go to the next slide. And I showed the Office 365 kind of login there because so many people are moving to Office 365 for mail services, but you could do the same thing with like a on-site Outlook web access or for Google Mail or whoever your mail. And we see a lot of people who have that multi-factor authentication on things like their VPN and their remote desktop service, but they don't have multi-factor authentication on their email because the mindset is, what's the risk in one email account? Well, through all the attacks we're seeing today, we're actually seeing there's a lot of risk in that one email account. You know, once we break into an email account during a pen test, first thing we do is search for the word password, and we'll find that they've emailed passwords to other people, other people have emailed passwords to them. So now we've got some additional passwords we could use to do some evil with. If we don't have the passwords, well, we could see that this is the email account that's associated with Salesforce, that's associated with their bank account, that's associated with different things. Let's go to that site and go through the password reset process and see if we can reset the password, get an email with a link to reset that password now that we're in the mailbox, and now we maybe have access to that cloud services, or to that cloud service we attacked. Mailboxes often have stored sensitive information. Again, when people have their mailboxes broken into, they're often having us go through and enumerate, okay, I may need to notify customers because they've emailed us credit card numbers to that mailbox, or social security numbers on tax forms or things like that. Mailboxes nowadays are so full of thousands of messages or tens of thousands of messages, you don't really realize how much sensitive data stacks up in there over time. In addition to that, the attacker, once they're into that email account, will use that account for further phishing attacks. You know, maybe they figured out that the email account they got into was an insurance agent at your insurance agency, but they also could, from the mailbox, could figure out who the accounts payable person is for that agency. So now they'll use that insurance person's agent's mailbox to target the accounts payable person, because that's a juicy person to get access to, because maybe I can then try and, you know, redirect financial transactions, you know, send modified invoices with incorrect payment information, modify wire requests, ACH instructions, things like that. So we see a lot of attacks nowadays that start with a break into one email account and then spread from there to other email accounts, to other cloud services. It's a big risk. We go to the next slide. And here I just want to show an example. Again, this is very much a real world example that we've seen. Shannon has a relationship with Jim. Apparently they're in the, you know, they get a monthly invoice for services. Jim calls up Shannon and says, hey Shannon, we're changing banks. When I send you the next invoice, I'm going to send you new wiring instructions. Normal thing that would happen, it's the real Jim, it's the real Shannon. And even if we go to the next slide, the follow-up email that Shannon receives looks very legitimate. It looks identical to every invoice she's ever received. It's got Jim's correct footer, even maybe comes from Jim's mailbox, and it has that new wiring instruction information that he had said he would send. Okay, this all makes sense. Well, what we're actually seeing is when the attackers are able to break into one mailbox, whether it's Jim's mailbox or Shannon's mailbox, they're able to set up some sophisticated things like forwarding rules. So only the attacker gets the real message, and the attacker can tweak that real message and send it on to Shannon with fake wiring instructions. So even though Jim tried to do the right thing by validating out of line by phone that a change was happening, the attacker was still able to manipulate that payment because they manipulated the email in transit because they had broken into a mailbox. And Jim and Shannon didn't verify on the phone the actual, okay, we've changed banks, our new bank SWIFT code is this, our new account number is this. You need to verify those things on the phone and not just say that a change is going to happen, because the attackers are typically in so deep, waiting, lurking for that opportunity to make a change like this. Next slide, please. And, you know, that's just one of the many shady tactics the attackers are doing today. We're seeing a lot of phishing attacks that take advantage of these COVID-19 interruptions or the concerns that people have about, you know, the ancillary things like attacks about retirement account issues or balances, surveys, attacks from companies saying these are COVID-19 response, just things that people are worried about getting them to take action, like giving up a password, logging into something, opening a document that they normally wouldn't. As I said, these attacks happen because the sender's mailbox is compromised, because your internal employee receiver's mailbox is compromised. We've even seen like attacks. I had an attack recently where a investment company was trying to invest $1 million into like a .com startup. And so there were three entities involved in this. There was the investment company with the $1 million to send. There was their attorney, who was a different company or a different organization. And then there was the recipient, the .com startup. And the attacker had breached one of the mailboxes of one of those three parties and kind of lurked for weeks, watching that they were discussing this financial transferred that was going to happen and how it was going to happen, and the attorney was involved and all that kind of stuff. The attacker actually spun up another domain that looked a lot like the attorney's domain. The attacker, intercepted a number of incoming and outgoing messages so that he could change information on them. And the attacker got them to redirect 2 different wires, each for $500,000 to an offshore account, just through this combination of man-in-the-middle forwarding rules and manipulating messages and knowing what was going on. So real sophisticated, hard to catch unless you've got really strict rules about, validating key information by phone multiple times over, things like that. Again, the attackers are taking advantage of vacation, out of office, because they see what's going on. And then these follow-on attacks. Okay, so maybe my attempt to redirect ACH or wire transfers failed, but before I did that, I gathered, you're the accounts payable person or whatever. I've gathered all the information about all the other parties that you've received invoices from or sent invoices to, and now I'll start targeting them with phishing attacks, hoping I can take over their mailboxes and just continue to do these phishing attacks, particularly against people in financial roles. Next slide, please. So what are the key things we can do to protect against this? Multi-factor authentication is a big one. We have seen a couple of attacks that even bypass that multi-factor authentication. For example, like that tab natting would allow somebody to also steal your MFA token or get you, you think you're logging in at that time when really the attacker's logging in at that time and watching your traffic. But multi-factor authentication still goes very far to stop that, but you need to have it on email and add it to your Salesforce and other cloud services. Miles had mentioned before, one of the tests that Salesforce Security Health Check looks for, one of the first ones is, do you have MFA enabled, to make sure that you can't just log into Salesforce with the user ID and password. Make sure your mail system doesn't have forwarding rules to send messages outbound to potentially the attacker. That's an important way that they're using to, again, intercept and manipulate messages under the radar. And then finally, talking to your financial institution. Are there additional services you can add there, especially for these payment attacks? Things like ACH positive pay, where you predefine what companies you're going to send ACH payments to. Setting up transaction limits, so an attacker, if they do have a successful attack, is limited by how much they could steal in one day. And then dual authorization, where one person in your organization sets up the wire or the ACH, and then the other person has some formal processes to verify that that's a valid transaction, and then that second person approves it. You can proceed. So those are the 2 most common attacks that we're seeing against organizations like the folks on the call here today, the ransomware attacks and those email account takeovers moving into cloud account takeovers or financial fraud or things like that. So how can you gauge how good your organization is positioned against these attacks? Well, on the next slide here, we've got some key questions. The first one is, I even talked earlier, like, okay, these attacks aren't taking advantage of missing patches, they're not taking advantage of missing antivirus, but those things still provide a good layer of security against being the weakest link, being the one somebody's going to target. So you want to make sure that you're still managing the basics, like patching, like antivirus, and you really need to manage that centrally, or you don't know what's going on. If you're kind of just configuring workstations to update themselves, you'll never know if a workstation starts missing updates of its antivirus or its patches. Second one is everything important backed up, and then our backups protected from deletion. We talked about both of those things already, because attackers really, ransomware attackers, these cyber extortion attackers really are looking to destroy those backups as part of that attack. Next big thing, do we have multi-factor authentication on our VPN, on our email, and on all our cloud services? Because that password is now that first line of defense, and passwords are so easy to steal, to guess, to get through phishing, to people do foolish things like reuse them on other websites that get hacked. Passwords just aren't, even good, strong, long passwords can be broken, and that's why we all need multi-factor authentication pretty much everywhere. And then what testing are we doing? You're never going to know what gaps you missed, what things aren't configured right, how an attacker might break in, unless you test to see if those holes are there or if they're closed. So those are some good key questions to ask whoever's managing your IT for you, to get some sense of, are they on top of things? Have they missed some key things here? We go to the next slide. All right, next big question. How do you make sure any outsourced technology functions are secure? So we're all outsourcing using cloud services like Salesforce a lot more nowadays. It's interesting, 5-10 years ago, the big question everybody was asking me was, why would I want to put my stuff in the cloud? Doesn't that make it less secure? I'm scared because I don't have control over it anymore. And my answer back then, and still is today, your data is safer in the cloud because that cloud service provider is spending millions of dollars on their security controls, and you probably aren't. And it's more likely someone's going to break into your network than break into the cloud service, except for your users' passwords, as we said. So if we go to the next slide here, what are some of the key things to look at? It's really about vendor management. So first one is vendor assessment. When you're choosing that cloud service or some other outsourced service for that technology function, it's the due diligence of, are they giving us the right recommendations? Do they have multi-factor authentication available? Do they give us the security review of our account, like the Salesforce health check? Do they have something like that available? What tools do they have available to make sure things are being done right and guiding us before we sign that contract? And then after we sign that contract, the ongoing vendor management. So not just sit and forget about it, or set it and forget about it. Setting up recurring meetings with the vendor to go over our help desk tickets getting resolved quickly. Are our concerns being managed? Are they making improvements to their environment? Do we see that they're in a healthy financial condition? All those things to just manage and monitor that the vendor is giving you what you'd expect. And in the same vein, contractual enforcement. A lot of times these cloud services, include in the contracts service level agreements. If you have outages, you're supposed to get these compensation for it. They're supposed to have these other things available to you. But maybe you get lazy and don't look for those when you should expect them. So again, those recurring meetings with your vendor with a checklist of what are you expecting from your vendor every quarter, every year, and what do you expect for outages, and what are their service level agreements, and are they meeting those? Can they prove that stuff to you, just to keep them on their toes? Strong authentication, you keep hearing it, but it's the most important thing. By strong, we mean multi-factor authentication, some way to get beyond just a password to get people, know if people are when people are logging in there, who they say they are. And then finally, logging. And again, Miles had brought up some of the advanced features of Salesforce and Shield with the audit logging and things like that. That is super important. When we see these email account breaches where, they start with an email account and then move to a cloud service, our customers hate when they come to us and say, hey, we saw that this, we saw in the event log that this person logged into our Salesforce account on Thursday, the 22nd. Can you tell us what they looked at? What customers do we need to contact because their information has been breached? Well, if you don't have this type of audit logging enabled in your cloud services, we're going to come back and say, yeah, we saw the attacker logged in, but there's no record of what they looked at. So every customer in your database is potentially has been potentially disclosed to the attacker, and you probably need to reach out to them about the breach. Whereas if you have this audit logging, you might see that they only looked at a few records, or they didn't even ever look at customer records. They were just trying to look at security settings or things like that. So many people, when they come to us for forensic investigations, at that point learn how much they regret not having spent more time enabling logging in their cloud services, extending logging for their on-site servers and things like that, to just have that level of detail when something bad happens. Next slide, please. And then last, what do you do if you have a breach? And if we go to the next slide. So first and foremost, I hope your organization has an incident response plan. If it doesn't, you really need to put one together now, because at the time of the incident is not the time to start figuring out who are our contacts, who are our resources, what are their first steps to take, who do we need to communicate. All those kind of things get defined in your incident response plan. So if you have a breach, you're pulling that off the shelf and kind of following those steps in it. There's so many parts to an incident response, and they're so unique to what your business is and where your data is. I can't really go into detail there, but it's important that you build a plan or work with somebody outside your organization to help you build a plan in case that kind of stuff occurs. But at that point then, it's important to contact outside experts that you've identified pretty early. Hopefully you've got legal counsel that you can reach out to, potentially cybersecurity insurance. They might, as part of that contract, direct you to a legal expert that will help you as kind of a breach coach, but that they're there to represent you. So know what's available from your insurance carrier, what they're going to do when you reach out to them with a potential breach, and know your insurance carrier contract. If you've got cybersecurity insurance, know that contract well, because a lot of them have certain stipulations of you may need to make a police report to get coverage. You may need to contact them within a certain period of time to get coverage. You may have to have a forensic and incident response firm vetted before they can respond to your incident. So be aware of those things, understand what's in your contract, but then reaching out and potentially pulling in a forensic and incident response firm like Sikich to help understand, what did the attacker do? Are they still in our network? What do we have to do to clean it up? And then, like I said, there's not, I can't give you the whole list of what to do to respond if a breach occurs, but I want to highlight a couple of the kind of key mistakes that people make when this happens. The first one here, I've got it listed as disconnect systems from the internet if possible. So people often drag their feet like, hey, we've got some encrypted computers, but we need to keep up and running. Like, is the attacker still there? And that typically ends up being a mistake. One of the first things you want to do as soon as you get an opportunity is to stop that attacker from having any more capability to control the viruses or control computers in your network. And you do that pretty much by disconnecting systems in two ways. The first way is disconnect outbound connections in. So, turn off your VPN or your remote desktop or whatever your remote access services are. Turn those off, shut them off until you've had a chance to change everybody's password across the entire network, because you don't know which account the attacker might be using to log in from the internet. And he might have multiple accounts. So even if he's always been using Joe's account up till now, he might also know Sally's password and Joan's password because he stole them off of internal computers and just hasn't used them yet. So disconnect outside in systems, but also disconnect the ability for internal systems to reach out. So a lot of times once an attacker gets a foothold on the internal network, they'll install what we call backdoors or bots that basically run on internal computers and use like browser web requests out to the internet to get instructions from the attacker. We call that a command and control channel. And really the only way to kind of stop that early is to block everybody on the internal network from getting out to the internet until you've identified every system where the attacker might be or might have been and made sure that they're clean and safe, that you can start letting traffic out again. So yeah, don't delay in disconnecting until you're confident that the attacker is no longer in your network and no longer has credentials to get back in. And the other big mistake I see is not preserving evidence. Good examples of this are the attacker took out our file server or our database server, and we need to get back up and running. So we're gonna format the disk of that server, reinstall it, and restore from backup. Well, then 2 days later, people are asking, what did the attacker do? What did they steal from that server? Did they get to customer information? Well, you've already wiped that server and any artifacts that the attacker might have left about what they did when they were there. So you've destroyed some of that evidence in your rush to get back up and running. And it's a hard balance. You want to get back up and running quickly, but you need to understand where and how you can maybe preserve that evidence before you do that, get back up and running. And whether that's a server or a workstation, you know, what are you going to regret later that you deleted as part of your incident response? And logs are the other issue with preserving evidence. As I said earlier, Windows with its default settings in a lot of cases will only store 3 days worth of critical logs, like security event logs, who logged in when. And if you haven't changed those default settings, then the first day you notice the attack on Monday, the third day of the attack, and you're already overriding logs from Friday and maybe into Saturday. And by the time you call us on Tuesday and we get involved, now we only have data from Sunday to try and grab off those servers. So, you know, being aware of that and going, okay, we've been breached, have our IT staff copy all the Windows logs off the servers right away to someplace safe before they get overwritten. Kind of that's at the time. Before the fact, yeah, look at what kind of logging retention you have and maybe increase that so you're not in such a rush to retain those logs at the time of an attack.